The factory's still there. Different logo, different employees, different corporation running the buildings. But the hangars remain. The concrete remains. The long runway where some of America's most secret aircraft once took shape. Still there. Silent. At its peak, more than 84,000 people worked inside this industrial empire. Engineers, machinists, physicists, missile designers. This factory helped build the Cold War. It developed weapon systems, satellites, radar technology, projects so secret most Americans never even knew they existed. And behind all of it was one man, a billionaire obsessed with speed, control, and aviation. His name was Howard Hughes. This is the story of the Hughes Aircraft Factory, how it became one of the most powerful aerospace complexes in America, and how it slowly disappeared. Chapter 1. Oil, Obsession, and Orphan. Before there was a factory, there was a drill bit. Howard Hughes Sr. was born in 1869 in Lancaster, Missouri. Tried law school at Harvard, dropped out after a year, finished his degree in Iowa, passed the bar, then walked away from law entirely. In 1902, he packed his bags and went to Texas, oil country. Everyone was chasing the same thing. The problem was the rock. The tools drillers used, fishtail bits, cut through soft ground fine. Hit hard rock and you stopped dead. Texas was full of hard rock. Hughes watched fortune stall at the same geological wall over and over, so he decided to solve it. In 1908, working with his partner Walter Sharp, he built a prototype from wood, a two-cone rotary bit, two spinning cones covered in cutting teeth that crushed through rock instead of scraping it. Patent filed November 20th, 1908. Granted August 10th, 1909. U.S. patents 930,758 and 930,759. Drillers called it the Rock Eater. It cut hard rock 10 times faster than anything before it. Hughes didn't sell the bits. He leased them. You paid every time you used one. Sharp Hughes Tool became Hughes Tool after Sharp died in 1912. By 1934, a redesigned tri-cone bit had pushed their market share to nearly 100% of global oil drilling. That was the inheritance waiting for the son. Aline Gano was Houston society, educated, elegant, and deeply anxious. The birth of Howard Jr. in December 1905 was difficult. After that, something shifted. She became obsessed with protecting her only child. When disease hit the city, she moved him out. Washed his hands repeatedly, checked every surface, terrified of germs in a way that went beyond caution. She was planting seeds without knowing it. Howard Jr., the family called him Sonny, grew up wealthy and restless. He built a short-wave radio from salvaged parts. When his mother refused a motorcycle, he wired a car starter motor to his bicycle. At 14, his father took him up in a Curtiss flying boat. One flight. That was enough. Then the losses hit. Fast. 1922. His mother died during surgery. Howard was 16. 1924. His father collapsed at his desk. Heart attack, age 54. Howard was 18. 2 years. 2 parents. Gone. He walked into a Texas courtroom and convinced a judge to declare him a legal adult at 19. Inherited 75% of Hughes Tool Company. Bought out the remaining relatives. Took full control. No parents. No degree. Complete ownership of one of the most profitable industrial operations in America. Everything that followed, the factory, the aircraft, the obsessions, started right here. Chapter 2. Hell's Director. Howard Hughes didn't move to Hollywood because he loved movies. He moved there because he wanted to make something the whole world would see. In 1925, he married Ella Botts Rice and relocated to Los Angeles. He was 19. He had more money than he knew what to do with and zero interest in playing it safe. His first film was called Swell Hogan. It was so bad it never got released. Hughes didn't flinch. He co-produced Two Arabian Nights in 1927. It won the Oscar for Best Director of a Comedy. People started paying attention. Then he went completely off the rails, in the best possible way. Hell's Angels started in 1927, a war film about Royal Air Force pilots in World War I. Most directors would have built sets and used camera tricks. Hughes bought the real thing, over 87 actual WWI-era aircraft. German, British, French. He hired more than 70 pilots to fly them on camera. The production ran for 3 years. Halfway through, The Jazz Singer came out, and the entire industry flipped overnight to sound. Hell's Angels was almost finished. As a silent film, Hughes scrapped it and started over. Full reshoots, full sound production. The Norwegian lead actress, Greta Nissen, was let go because her accent didn't fit the new dialogue. Hughes replaced her with an unknown 20-year-old named Jean Harlow. Nobody had heard of her. Within 2 years, she was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. Hughes fired at least 3 directors, including Marshall Nealon and Luther Reed. He took over the aerial sequences himself. When one particular stunt was too dangerous, every hired pilot refused to fly it. Hughes climbed into the cockpit personally. He crashed, broke bones, recovered, then went back and shot the scene anyway. 3 men died making that film. Pilot Clement Phillips was killed transporting an aircraft to the set. Pilot Rupert McAllister died during a flying sequence. Mechanic Phil Jones went down inside a plane he couldn't escape in time. The final cost was somewhere between $2.8 and $3.8 million, roughly $78 million today. It opened May 27, 1930 at Grauman's Chinese Theater to massive crowds. Box office hit. Still didn't fully recoup what he spent. Hughes didn't care. That was the pattern. Spend without a ceiling. Accept any risk. Refuse to compromise. Deliver something technically extraordinary, even if it costs more than it earns. He would run that same playbook inside the aircraft factory. Sometimes it produced miracles. Sometimes it nearly destroyed everything. In 1932, while still in the film industry, Hughes quietly leased hangar space at Burbank Airport from Lockheed Aircraft. He registered Hughes Aircraft Company as a division of Hughes Tool. No government contracts, no defense clients, no business plan. Just one objective: build the fastest airplane in the world. That was the beginning. Chapter 3: The Fastest Man Alive. The first Hughes Aircraft facility wasn't much to look at. A rented hangar at Burbank Airport, a small crew, no government backing, no corporate sponsor. Hughes pulled his lead mechanic from the Hell's Angels film crew, Glenn Odekirk, a man he trusted completely, and brought in aeronautical designer Richard Palmer. That was the core team. They moved to Grand Central Airport in Glendale, California. More space, better runway. And there, in a hangar, most people drove past without a second glance. They started building the H-1 Racer. The goal was simple and completely unreasonable: build the fastest aircraft a private citizen had ever flown. Every surface was engineered to fight drag. The fuselage was duralumin, lightweight aluminum alloy. The wings were polished plywood, smooth enough to reflect light. The rivets were flush-mounted and individually machined, each one oriented to follow the airflow. The landing gear retracted fully into the wing, unusual for 1935. The cockpit canopy sealed shut during flight. A scale model went into Caltech's 200 miles per hour wind tunnel. The real aircraft later matched the predictions almost exactly. The engine, a Pratt & Whitney R1535, 14 cylinders, over 1,000 horsepower. 2 sets of wings, a short span set for speed runs, a longer set for distance. First flight, August 17, 1935. Hughes flew 15 minutes, landed. A bevel gear in the propeller governor had failed. Couldn't push past 250 miles per hour. Engineers fixed it that day, September 13, 1935. Martin Field near Santa Ana. Hughes loaded minimum fuel. Every pound cost speed. 4 passes over the measured course. Average 352.39 miles per hour. A new world land speed record for aircraft. Not military, not government-funded. A privately built machine with a 2-man core team. He ran out of fuel after the final pass. Dead stick landing in a sugar beet field. No serious damage. When his crew arrived, the first thing he said was, "We can fix her. She'll go faster." The H-1 was the last privately built aircraft to ever hold the world airspeed record. Everyone after went to military designs. January 19, 1937. Hughes swapped in the long-span wings and flew Los Angeles to Newark, New Jersey in 7 hours, 28 minutes, 25 seconds. Another record, July 10, 1938. He left New York in a modified Lockheed 14 Super Electra with a crew of 4. Paris, Moscow, Omsk, Yakutsk, Fairbanks. Back to New York. Total elapsed time, 91 hours, 14 minutes. Wiley posts around the world record had stood at 7 days and 18 hours. Hughes cut it to under 4 days. Over 1 million people lined the streets of New York. Ticker tape from every window. Newspapers called him the Spirit of America. Back in California, he was already buying land. 380 acres of marshland in Culver City, just north of where LAX sits today. A private runway, new hangars, a real factory. The records were done. The real work was just beginning. Chapter 4. Wood, War, and the Wreck on Whittier Drive. When the war started, the government came to Hughes. 2 contracts, 2 aircraft. Both would define his legacy. Not the way anyone expected. The first was the XF-11, a twin-engine reconnaissance plane built to fly high and fast, carrying cameras instead of guns. Each engine drove contra-rotating propellers, 2 sets of blades spinning in opposite directions on the same shaft, maximizing thrust. The government ordered 100 of them in 1943. Hughes missed every deadline. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, not one had been delivered. The second contract was bigger. German U-boats were destroying Allied supply lines across the Atlantic, ships sinking faster than they could be replaced. The solution: fly the cargo over the ocean. Hughes was asked to build a flying boat large enough to carry 750 soldiers, or 2 fully loaded Sherman tanks, from America to England in a single flight. Aluminum was rationed, so Hughes built it from wood, birch plywood bonded with phenolic resin, a composite called Duramold. The H-4 Hercules had a wingspan of 320 feet, wider than a football field, a tail standing 79 feet off the water. 8 Pratt & Whitney R4360 engines, 3,000 horsepower each. The control surfaces were too large to move by hand, so Hughes engineered a hydraulic flight assistance system, an early precursor to fly-by-wire controls. The war ended before it flew. The government pulled funding. Hughes finished it with his own money. July 7, 1946. Hughes took the XF-11 up for its first test flight. An hour in, oil leaked into the rear propeller assembly on the right engine. The rear blades reversed pitch. Instead of pulling forward, they dragged backward on one side. The plane rolled. Hughes aimed for the Los Angeles Country Club golf course and didn't reach it. The XF-11 hit 3 houses in Beverly Hills. The third, 808 North Whittier Drive, home of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Myers, chief interpreter at the Nuremberg trials, burned completely. A Marine corporal named William Durkin, visiting his girlfriend nearby, pulled Hughes from the wreckage. Broken collarbone, 6 broken ribs, collapsed left lung, heart displaced to the right side of his chest, 3rd-degree burns, deep facial lacerations. The ER doctors didn't expect him to survive the night. At Good Samaritan Hospital, they gave him morphine. He stayed 35 days. Researchers who later studied Hughes traced his addiction, morphine, codeine, Valium, back to that room. A quiet dependency running underneath everything for 30 years. From that same bed, still in pain, he called in engineers and redesigned the hospital bed itself. The modern adjustable hospital bed used worldwide today came out of that conversation. November 2nd, 1947. Congress had been investigating him. $22 million in contracts. Nothing delivered. During a break in the Senate hearings, he flew to Long Beach Harbor, taxied the H-4 twice across the water. Reporters assumed routine testing and began packing up. Third run. All 8 throttles forward. The Hercules lifted off, climbed to 70 feet, flew 1 mile in under 60 seconds. Then it landed. And never flew again. Hughes kept it in a climate-controlled hangar for the rest of his life. $1 million a year just to preserve it. That afternoon at Long Beach was the last time Howard Hughes appeared in public as an aviation man. Chapter 5. The Man Who Managed Everything by Phone. By the late 1940s, Howard Hughes controlled more of America than most people realized. He owned 78% of Trans World Airlines, one of the largest carriers in the world. In 1948, he bought RKO Pictures for $9 million, becoming the sole owner of one of Hollywood's 5 major studios. He never set foot on the lot after signing the papers. He ran the entire studio through phone calls and layers of intermediaries. Actors and directors waited weeks for decisions that arrived late, incomplete, or not at all. He managed the whole operation like a man trying to run a city through a door he never once opened. At Hughes Aircraft, the post-war direction was correct. Warplanes were yesterday. Electronics were tomorrow. The company landed a contract in 1950 to develop fire control systems for Air Force fighters. Technology that could automatically track and engage enemy aircraft. To build it, Hughes recruited 2 of the finest technical minds in the country. Simon Ramo held a physics doctorate from Caltech. Dean Wooldridge came out of Bell Labs. Together, they were building integrated electronic weapons systems that would define military aviation for a generation. Under their direction, Hughes Aircraft had real capability and genuine forward momentum. But functioning inside the company was becoming impossible. After the 1946 crash, Hughes had changed, and the changes kept accelerating. He began issuing written instructions to his staff. Not memos, manuals, multi-page documents explaining how to open a food can using only specific paper towels, diagrams detailing how an aide must position himself in a room to avoid transmitting germs across the space. Every communication was routed through multiple layers of intermediaries. Notes passed through 3 pairs of hands before reaching him. Responses came back the same way. Hours later, sometimes days. Inside the factory, this produced paralysis. Hughes overruled senior engineers by phone on incomplete information. Contracts sat unsigned for weeks while negotiations fell apart. Payroll documents went unprocessed, not once as an isolated mistake, but repeatedly as a pattern. Tens of thousands of employees missed scheduled paychecks because the man who owned the company would not sign the authorization. Executives couldn't book a meeting. They waited for the phone to ring. Ramo and Wooldridge hit their limit in 1953. They requested a direct meeting to discuss restructuring basic management operations. Hughes refused. Both resigned the same day. They founded the Ramo-Wooldridge Corporation, which later merged with Thomson Products to form TRW Incorporated, a company that spent the next 4 decades competing directly against Hughes Aircraft in space and defense systems. Dozens of senior engineers and managers followed them out. The people with the most options left first. The factory remained capable of serious work, but it was hemorrhaging the talent that made it exceptional. Hughes responded by restructuring ownership. Profits at Hughes Aircraft had grown large enough to generate serious annual tax liability. In 1953, he transferred full ownership of the company into the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, a nonprofit he had just created. A charitable institution pays no income tax on business earnings. On paper, HHMI funded medical research. In practice, it was a holding structure. Hughes retained control of both entities through the charter, genuinely clever. And it contained a flaw that wouldn't surface for 30 years. Because HHMI was a nonprofit, Hughes Aircraft could no longer be run like a private company. Charitable ownership restricted profit use, management authority, and what would happen to the asset when its creator was gone. Hughes didn't think about that last part. Nobody pushed him to. That quiet decision in 1953 would eventually force the sale of everything. Chapter 6. The factory that ran without its founder. In November 1954, a man named Lawrence Hyland walked through the doors of Hughes Aircraft and quietly took control. His title was Vice President and General Manager. His real job was to save the place. Hyland came from Bendix Corporation in New Jersey, a disciplined engineer and a capable executive, the complete opposite of everything Hughes had become. Hughes remained chairman in name. In practice, Hyland ran every decision that mattered. He rebuilt the engineering teams, established functional management processes, and restored the confidence of defense clients who had grown tired of waiting on a company that couldn't keep its own payroll on schedule. What followed is one of the stranger stories in American industrial history. The founder disappeared. The company became dominant. Under Hyland, Hughes Aircraft moved into guided weapons and electronic systems and started winning. The AIM-4 Falcon became the first air-to-air missile deployed at scale by the U.S. Air Force, installed on thousands of American fighters. The TOW missile, tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided, gave infantry the ability to destroy tanks at range without exposing themselves to direct fire. Introduced in the late 1960s and used extensively in Vietnam, the TOW was eventually adopted by more than 40 countries and remains in active service worldwide as of 2026. The AGM-65 Maverick, guided by television or infrared sensor, became a standard air-to-ground weapon across multiple military branches and saw combat from Vietnam through the Gulf War and beyond. By the early 1970s, Hughes Aircraft was the largest supplier of military electronics, radar systems, and guided weapons in the United States. None of it happened because of Howard Hughes. All of it happened while he was in a dark room somewhere, unreachable. The most consequential achievement of the era came from a small team inside the factory working on a problem most considered theoretically interesting and practically out of reach. In 1958, a physicist named Harold Rosen began developing the geostationary satellite. Arthur C. Clarke had described the concept in 1945. A satellite at exactly 35,786 kilometers above the equator would orbit at the same rate the Earth rotates, appearing fixed in the sky, able to relay signals continuously to the same ground stations below. Nobody had built one. Rosen and colleagues Thomas Hudspeth and Donald Williams spent years designing a satellite light enough for the rockets then available. NASA funded the program, $4 million for 3 satellites, under the name SYNCOM. SYNCOM 1 failed. February 14, 1963. Signal lost at orbital insertion. SYNCOM 2 succeeded. July 26, 1963. President Kennedy placed a call from the White House to Nigerian Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa in Lagos. The first satellite telephone exchange between 2 heads of state. SYNCOM 3 launched August 19, 1964. True geostationary orbit, fixed above the Pacific. On October 19th, it broadcast the Tokyo Olympics opening ceremony live across the ocean to American television. First live transmission from a permanently stationary satellite. Harold Rosen watched from a lab in Culver City. His words: "I was amazed at the picture quality." SYNCOM 3 remained operational until 2012. It is still physically in orbit. That same year, 1966, Hughes built Surveyor 1 for NASA, the first spacecraft to execute a controlled soft landing on the Moon. It analyzed lunar soil and confirmed the surface could support a crewed lander. Surveyor 3, 5, 6, and 7 followed, all manufactured in Culver City. When Apollo 12 landed in 1969, the crew touched down close enough to Surveyor 3 to walk over and retrieve a piece of it. By 1982, annual payroll at Hughes Aircraft exceeded $1.6 billion. By 1985, the workforce reached 84,000. Revenue hit $11 billion in 1986. Fortune magazine described the company as a national asset the Department of Defense could not afford to lose. Howard Hughes had been absent from operations for more than 2 decades. The factory had never been more powerful. Stir Chapter 7. The Ghost in the Penthouse. While the factory in Culver City was launching satellites and landing spacecraft on the Moon, Howard Hughes was sitting alone in the dark. By 1950, he had stopped appearing in public entirely. No press events, no board meetings. He rented entire floors of hotels, blacked out every window, and surrounded himself with male aides, later nicknamed the Mormon Mafia, who followed his instructions without question and shielded him from the outside world. In 1957, he secretly married actress John Peters. Both used false names on the registration. They barely lived together. Peters later described the marriage as living with a stranger. They divorced in 1971. Through the early 1960s, Hughes still owned 78% of Trans World Airlines, but managed nothing. TWA sued Hughes Tool Company in 1961, alleging his mismanagement had damaged the airline. Hughes refused to appear for deposition. A court stripped his voting rights at the company. When the legal exposure became untenable, he sold his entire TWA stake in 1966 for $546.5 million. One of the largest private transactions in American history at the time. He left Los Angeles immediately to avoid California income tax and moved to Las Vegas. In November 1966, Hughes arrived at the Desert Inn by private rail car, in pajamas, carried on a stretcher up the service elevator to the 9th floor penthouse. He planned to stay 10 days, when owner Mo Dalitz asked him to vacate for New Year's high rollers. Hughes bought the hotel for $13.2 million. His manager, Robert Mayhew, later said, Hughes had no intention of buying a hotel. He just wanted somewhere to sleep. Over the next 3 years, without leaving his room, Hughes bought the Sands, Castaways, and Frontier casinos for roughly $60 million. Then the Silver Slipper and the Landmark for another $23 million. At his peak, he controlled approximately 20% of all hotel rooms on the Strip. He never saw a single one of them. When staff entered the penthouse after Hughes left in 1970, the blackout curtains had rotted through. They had never been opened. The behaviors inside that room had become extreme. Hughes sat unclothed in the dark for days at a time. He watched the film Ice Station Zebra on repeat, a minimum of 150 consecutive viewings. He handled every object through layers of Kleenex tissue. He stopped cutting his hair, beard, and fingernails. A condition called allodynia had made physical contact acutely painful. He communicated with staff exclusively through notes pushed under the door. At one point, he bought the entire local supply of Banana Ripple ice cream, fearing the flavor would be discontinued. Days later, he decided he only wanted chocolate marshmallow. The Desert Inn gave away Banana Ripple free to casino guests for nearly a year. In November 1970, Hughes was carried out on a stretcher in the middle of the night. He flew to the Bahamas, then Nicaragua, Canada, England, Mexico, moving between blacked-out penthouses, always ahead of process servers, lawyers, and journalists. He ran a multi-billion-dollar empire through handwritten notes passed by intermediaries. April 5, 1976. Hughes was in Acapulco in acute renal failure. His aides placed him on his private jet and flew toward Houston. He died somewhere over South Texas. He was 70 years old. The FBI fingerprinted the body to confirm identity. The face was unrecognizable. He weighed under 90 pounds, 6 feet 4 inches tall, broken needles still embedded in his arms, multiple old fractures untreated. The first doctor to examine him listed the cause of death as total self-neglect. No valid will. Over 40 fraudulent wills appeared. More than 400 people claimed to be heirs. A Nevada truck driver named Melvin Dummer said Hughes had flagged him down on a desert highway, leaving him $156 million in a handwritten will. A court ruled it a forgery in 1978. The man who built one of the most powerful industrial complexes in America died alone, unidentified, on a plane going home. Chapter 8. The car company that bought a rocket factory. Howard Hughes died without a will. The company he built passed to no one in particular. Ownership of Hughes Aircraft sat inside the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, the structure Hughes had created in 1953 to shield profits from taxation. HHMOV continued operating the company after his death in April 1976. Lawrence Hyland officially became chairman and CEO, formalizing what he had already been doing in practice for more than 2 decades. But the arrangement that had protected Hughes from tax liability for 30 years now drew scrutiny from a completely new direction. The Internal Revenue Service began challenging HHMI's nonprofit classification. The argument was straightforward. A charitable medical research organization could not legitimately own one of America's largest defense contractors without violating the core terms of tax-exempt status. Profits flowing from Hughes Aircraft into HHMI were not supporting medical science in any meaningful way. They were sustaining a holding structure that no longer had a living person at the center of it. In 1984, a Delaware court agreed. HHMI was ordered to divest Hughes Aircraft to preserve its nonprofit standing. What followed was the most secretive corporate auction in American history. I ran a closed bidding process over 5 months. No public announcement, no press access. 3 serious bidders emerged: Ford Motor Company, Boeing, and General Motors. Ford wanted aerospace depth. Boeing wanted to consolidate the defense electronics sector. GM wanted what its leadership described as the future. Advanced technology it believed would transform the automobile business entirely. December 20th, 1985. General Motors was announced as the winner. The price, $5.2 billion, $2.7 billion in cash, and 50 million shares of newly created GM Class H stock. The largest corporate acquisition in American history at that moment. GM Chairman Roger Smith stood before reporters. Getting Hughes is like getting MIT and Caltech combined. Board member Ross Perot was seated close by. His response, "I'm not sure about that." December 31st, GM merged Hughes Aircraft with its Delco Electronics division to form Hughes Electronics Corporation. The Culver City factory, the engineers, the satellite programs, the weapon systems, all of it now belonged to a car company headquartered in Detroit. The performance numbers that followed remained striking. At acquisition, Hughes employed 84,000 people, peak headcount in company history. Revenue in 1986 reached $11 billion. In 1992, Hughes acquired General Dynamics Missile Division for $450 million, adding substantial precision weapons capability. By 1995, Hughes Space and Communications was the largest commercial satellite manufacturer in the world. 40% of all active commercial satellites in orbit had been built in Culver City. On paper, the trajectory looked continuous and unbroken. Inside the company, something had already shifted. Hughes Aircraft had always been engineer-led. Technical judgment drove decisions. The people who built things held authority over those who counted them. That culture, autonomous, patient with long development timelines, structurally resistant to bureaucracy, had produced the geostationary satellite, the lunar probes, and weapon systems still in active use decades after delivery. GM brought Detroit's operating model into that environment. Layered reporting hierarchies, quarterly performance targets, cost control frameworks adapted from automobile manufacturing and applied to aerospace engineering schedules. The logic was defensible in management theory. To engineers who had spent careers under a completely different system, it was institutional structure they neither recognized nor valued. The veterans began to leave, not dramatically, quietly, over years. A program manager retired early. A satellite engineer moved to a startup. A senior designer accepted a position at a competitor. Individually, each departure was routine. Together, they represented the steady erosion of institutional knowledge that had separated Hughes Aircraft from every other defense company in the country. GM had purchased the company with a clear belief. Aerospace and defense technology would transfer into the next generation of automobiles. Sensors, guidance systems, advanced electronics. The idea had genuine surface logic. It never materialized. The two industries ran on incompatible timelines with incompatible cultures, and the workforces had almost no practical overlap. Roger Smith's comparison to MIT and Caltech was never more than a press conference line. The factory kept producing. Revenue held strong. But the foundation had already started shifting in ways no balance sheet was built to detect. Chapter 9. Sold for parts. The Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991. The Cold War was over, and almost immediately, the industry built to fight it began to come apart. Congress moved quickly to collect what politicians called the peace dividend. Money freed by cutting defense budgets now that the primary threat had dissolved. For the aerospace and defense sector, this meant canceled contracts, reduced orders, and the start of a consolidation wave that would reshape the entire industry. Companies that had thrived on decades of Cold War spending faced a fundamental question. What were they for now? At GM's headquarters in Detroit, a parallel question was being asked about Hughes Electronics. The company was profitable, but it was not a car company. The original vision, defense technology flowing into automotive innovation, had never materialized into anything concrete. Hughes Electronics was generating revenue and consuming management attention in roughly equal measure. And shareholders were beginning to ask why a company that made automobiles was running the world's largest satellite manufacturer. The answer, eventually, was that it shouldn't be. The unwinding started gradually, then accelerated. In 1996, Hughes Electronics merged its fixed satellite services operation with Pan Am Sat, the commercial satellite provider used for television broadcasting and data transmission. Hughes became the dominant shareholder in the resulting entity. In 1997, GM moved Delco Electronics out of Hughes Electronics and back into its Delphi Automotive Systems unit. Delphi became independent in 1999. The original 1985 merger was beginning to reverse itself. Then came the transaction that ended everything. In January 1997, General Motors sold the defense and aerospace operations of Hughes Aircraft, the weapons systems, radar programs, guided missiles, and electronic warfare technology, to Raytheon Company for $9.5 billion. When the deal closed, the name Hughes Aircraft Company was formally retired. 63 years of continuous operation, 1934 to 1997. The number is worth noting. GM had paid $5.2 billion for all of Hughes Aircraft in 1985. 12 years later, it sold just the defense portion to Raytheon for $9.5 billion, nearly double the original purchase price for a fraction of the total asset. Raytheon absorbed the programs: the Tau missile, the Maverick, the Falcon, the radar systems, the electronic warfare divisions. All of it folded into Raytheon's defense portfolio under new branding. The Hughes name disappeared from the defense sector. In 2000, GM sold Hughes Space and Communications to Boeing for $3.75 billion. The engineers who had built SYNCOM-3 and the Surveyor probes and 40% of the world's commercial satellite fleet were now Boeing employees. The division was renamed the Boeing Satellite Development Center and later became Boeing Space. It builds satellites today, carrying the technical lineage of the original Hughes team under a different name. In 2003, the remaining Hughes Electronics assets, DirecTV, DirecTV Latin America, Pan Am Sat, and Hughes Network Systems, were acquired by News Corporation, Rupert Murdoch's media conglomerate. Renamed the DirecTV Group, the Hughes name disappeared from broadcasting and telecommunications. The automotive components unit eventually became Aptiv, a publicly traded vehicle electronics supplier. By 2003, no company anywhere was called Hughes Aircraft. No corporation with Hughes in the name was doing anything connected to its original purpose. The Culver City facility, where the H-1 racer had been assembled, where Spruce Goose components were fabricated, where 84,000 engineers had produced satellites, missiles, and radar systems, was repurposed across the years into office complexes, commercial studios, and technology campuses. The runway that had handled the most advanced private aircraft in the world became a parking structure. The hangars were converted or demolished. One remnant survived with meaningful continuity. HRL Laboratories, spun out from Hughes Research Laboratories in Malibu, continues operating today as a private research organization jointly owned by Boeing, General Motors, and Raytheon. The three companies that had absorbed pieces of Hughes Aircraft now jointly maintain the research institution that had always sat at the technical frontier of what the factory produced. Between 1985 and 2003, GM collected approximately $13.25 billion from selling Hughes in pieces, against the $5.2 billion it had paid for the whole thing in 1985. The return was substantial by any financial measure. The institution was gone. The name had vanished. The address had changed. The people had dispersed across competitors, startups, and retirements. What remained was the work they had left behind. Orbiting, targeting, landing, still functioning decades after the company that produced it had ceased to exist. Chapter 10. What outlasts everything Hughes Aircraft Company was formally dissolved in 1997. 63 years after Howard Hughes rented a hangar in Burbank with a small crew and a single objective, the name disappeared from every contract, every building, every filing. Before closing the books, it is worth taking stock of what actually remains. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute holds an endowment today exceeding $21 billion. It funds hundreds of scientists at leading universities and remains the largest private funder of biomedical research in the world. Hughes created HHMI in 1953 as a tax vehicle. It outlasted everything else he built and became, by a wide margin, his most constructive legacy. The H-1 racer sits in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. The Spruce Goose is on display at the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum in McMinnville, Oregon. The largest flying boat ever built, which flew once, for less than a mile, at 70 feet altitude. Surveyor 3, manufactured in Culver City, landed on the Moon in April 1967. Apollo 12 astronauts Pete Conrad and Alan Bean set down close enough to walk to it in November 1969. They removed its camera and brought it back to Earth. A piece of Hughes aircraft recovered from the Moon, now in the Smithsonian. The TOW missile remains in active service in more than 40 countries as of 2026. The AGM-65 Maverick is still flying. Both were designed at the Culver City factory. Every geostationary satellite in orbit today, every satellite TV signal, every GPS position derived from a fixed orbital point, operates on the architecture Harold Rosen and his team built at Hughes in the late 1950s. SYNCOM-3, launched in 1964, was never decommissioned. It is still up there. Now for what the story teaches. The first lesson is about untreated illness in a position of power. Hughes set world records while carrying the psychological seeds of what would become a crippling, unmanaged disorder. The 1946 crash did not create his OCD. It accelerated it and added addiction. The periods when Hughes was most absent from the company were its most productive. That is not a coincidence. Untreated illness in a founder does not stay contained. It spreads into decisions, org charts, and paychecks that arrive late. The second lesson is the founder paradox. Hughes Aircraft achieved its greatest output during the 30 years its founder was completely absent. When Hughes interfered from 1950 to 1953, the two engineers building the company's most critical capabilities walked out and founded a competitor. When Highland took over, the company built the geostationary satellite, landed spacecraft on the Moon, and produced weapon systems that defined the Cold War. The lesson is not that founders destroy companies. It is that knowing when to step back and building systems that don't require your presence is among the most consequential decisions a founder can make. The third lesson is about legal structure. Hughes placed the company inside HHMI in 1953 as a tax strategy. Clever in the short term. 30 years later, that same structure forced an unintended sale to an unintended buyer that dismantled everything. He left no will. The framework he built to maintain control became, after his death, the mechanism of dissolution. Succession planning is not an administrative formality. It has a multi-decade time horizon. The fourth lesson is for every executive who has purchased a company for its culture and then set about replacing it. GM bought Hughes believing defense technology would transfer into automobiles. It never happened. Not because the technology wasn't real, but because the culture that produced it couldn't survive inside a quarterly earnings cycle designed for car production. When you buy a company for what it knows and then change how it operates, you are methodically destroying what you paid to acquire. The fifth lesson requires almost no elaboration. The name is gone. The factory has a different sign. The runway is a parking structure. But if you look at the night sky and spot a point of light in slow, steady orbit, there is a real chance you're watching something designed in Culver City, California, by engineers who worked for Howard Hughes. He did not build his empire through good management. He built it by attempting things that credible people believed were out of reach. The H-1 racer, the round-the-world record, the geostationary satellite, the soft moon landing, each one, at the moment it was attempted, was considered impossible. That is the actual legacy, not the name on the building. What they built inside it. Syncom 3 went up in 1964. It has never been switched off. It is in orbit right now, 60 years later, circling in silence. Long after the factory that built it, the man who funded it, and every company that bought and sold it have all disappeared. Some things outlast everything, last.